Some of the things I will talk about today have briefly been touched by others, but the focus will be primarily on the psychological consequence of falling, which is fear of falling. So first of all, what is fear of falling? So when we ask a person whether they're concerned about falling and they say yes, it's always good to ask about the specific activities that they are concerned about. And what it really is, it's a persistent feeling that a person has about their personal risk of falling during those activities, and it's something that doesn't let them go. It's very prevalent. As you can see, the ranges up there, they're very wide. That all depends on the type of question that has been asked. But overall, what we can see is that it is very common in people who have fallen. About 2/3 of them would say they have a concern about falling. But it's also very common in people who have not fallen in the past. So about 1 in 3 would also say that they have some level of concern about falling. It's more common in women than in men. And it also increases with age. And there's many associated factors. So falls is one factor, but also obviously the physical factors. So if your balance is getting a little bit worse, if your gait is just not quite as stable anymore, general frailty, there's also a lot of psychological consequences and causes for fear of falling, such as depressed mood, generalized anxiety, and social isolation, and that's really when it becomes a problem. So when we see that a concern or a fear of falling it results in a reduced number of activities, so if in a restriction of activities that they're concerned about falling, that might lead into reduced physical function as well, which will then give them more difficulties during daily life, might lead to social isolation, more concern about falling, and eventually this will lead into falls, this negative spiral. So this is really what we're talking about, the negative spiral of concern about falling. But is it all bad? So that would be one thing that we often hear, well, fear of falling has to be helpful in a way, like it has to stop people from taking risks. And that's true. So fear of falling can reflect a realistic appraisal of their physical function, just reduced functional abilities as a result of aging. And that can happen because they have fallen or because they have an actual risk that they feel or perceive. And then concern about falling could potentially be a normal adaptive response to a challenged equilibrium. And that might just give people insight not to take any risks. So just a few examples. How do you feel about these activities? It's a bit risky. So a little bit concerned, I am. I would walk very carefully. How about this one? So these activities would be quite normal to be concerned about, and we actually want people to be concerned about them. But as people get older, they become more concerned about easier activities as well. So, and it might be just going to the shops or going to the market, crowded places. They might all induce some concern about falling. And that's when it becomes unhelpful. So if fear of falling is irrational and it's excessive, it's a phobia more than anything else, it's constantly there, then it will actually disrupt person's attention, and that will have an effect during daily life activities where there's lots of dual tasking and lots of things going on at the same time. And that kind of fear might result from a catastrophizing way of thinking about situations. And if this happens, then it's likely to have, in an extreme situation, have detrimental effects on several domains of quality of life. And if it really affects the way their choices that they make for their daily activities, then it might lead to social isolation as well. So just as a bit of an example, so this is based on a true story. An older man who really enjoyed going to the market. It was his one One thing that he did every week just to do his groceries and meet some people, but he had a fall and he could not get up, and he was so embarrassed that people had to come and help him. So he decided not to go to the market anymore. But that was one of his main social outings of the week, and that just dramatically affected his quality of life. So when we think about the helpful versus the unhelpful, we ran a study in 500 people. And we actually plotted people's actual fall risk against their perceived fall risk. So ideally we want people to be on that red line. So if they have a low actual fall risk, they should have a low perceived fall risk. And if they have a high actual fall risk, they should have a high perceived fall risk. So those would be the vigorous and the frail. So that would be adaptive. But how about the others? So the anxious and the stoics. And just a quick look at the plot, you can see that people, or these 500 people, they're scattered everywhere. So they don't follow this line. The correlation is there, but it's not very strong. And what we see is that the majority of the people do have a correct judgment of their abilities. So about 30% would be classed as vigorous, and about 40% would be classed as frail aware. And when we look at their falls rate, then we can see that the vigorous still fall, but they fall less, about 20%, and the frail aware, about 40% of them fall. But what is interesting is the other groups. So about 10% of our population of 500 community dwelling older people were anxious warriors. And what you can see in the fall rate is actually striking. So they fall as much as a frail aware, but there is actually no physical reason for them to fall. So what is going on? What is happening there? And that is what we're trying to understand. While the Stoics, call them the Aussie battlers as well sometimes, there's about 20% of the people, and they fall less than the others who also have a high fall risk, about 30%. So when we look at the warriors and we look at how they differ from others, then we can see that there is no obvious identifiable reason for them to fall. There is no bad balance, there is no poor strength. What we do see is that they perceive their health as worse than others, but they don't necessarily have more medical conditions than others. They have more depressive symptoms, and they also say that their quality of life is a lot less. And the main difference that we can see is their psychological profile. So they have a higher tendency for neurotic personality traits, so a bit more vulnerable to develop irrational fears. And this might be something that they have carried with them for their whole life. It's just expressed itself in concern about falling in old age. But when we think about the helpful side of fear of falling, physical decline as a result of aging is normal, and there will be continuous adjustments that people have to make, and they might have to catch up on them occasionally. They might take some risks and then have to adjust. And based on their perception, they have to just select an appropriate behavior. But the question is, how do people do that? And we ran an experiment. And another question is, can you overdo it? We asked people to walk at their normal pace in several conditions. One condition was just on the floor, and then there was another condition on a height, and we dimmed the lights as well, just to make it a little bit more scary. It wasn't super high, 60 centimeters, but high enough to induce some level of concern in case they would misstep. And what we saw was that if you look at the solid line, everyone, even people without fear of falling, they adapted their gait. So they walked a little bit slower, they walked a little bit with wider steps and shorter step length. So that seems to be the right strategy. But when we look at the people who were fearful, so we had a selection of people, so we made sure that they were balanced with fear and without fear, then you can see that they had a 30% reduction in their gait speed. You know, it was just a slightly different situation. It was a little bit scary, but it wasn't necessary to adapt that much. And what we saw really is that there is an appropriate adaptation, and there is also an excessive adaptation. And when people do that excessive change in their gait pattern, they actually make themselves more unstable, and they might actually directly induce fear of falling by being too cautious. So what does fear of falling tell us? It's a bad thing. That is the main story that we have to get out of here. Either a person has an accurate perception and we need to just make sure that their balance gets better, or a person might be increasing in a vicious circle of general frailty through depression and other psychological factors. When we look at the battlers, we can see that they're generally happy. They've got lower fear of falling, that they still have a high fall risk, but overall they just perceive their health as a lot better, and have a better quality of life. And the last point is actually very interesting. They also do more planned exercise, so that's good. So, and what can we learn from these Aussie battlers really is that even if your falls risk is high, that a positive attitude to life and just doing the right exercises will just reduce your risk of falling. And this actually takes me to the next part, which I will just briefly mention. Is we have developed a technology, an exercise, technology-based exercise program to improve balance and also have some cognitive behavioral strategies and behavioral change strategies in there. And how this is related to fear of falling is that we know that exercise can actually reduce fear of falling as well. We have done a systematic review and a meta-regression, and we can see that exercise is successful at reducing fear of falling. There's only one issue: it doesn't last. And what is the main problem with that is that people are probably likely not to persist in their exercise regime. So we really need to find a way to improve adherence in older people. And when we look at general adherence rates, and this is in research studies, so that's the best scenario possible. We actually call our participants to make sure that they do their exercises. Even in those conditions, we see attrition rates that are very high. After 1 year, only half of them still do the exercises. And we need to find ways to maximize adherence, and Kathy has already mentioned a few components there. And what we have learned from surveys and systematic reviews is that home-based exercise programs that include balance are likely to result in higher levels of adherence, and they should also have some behavioral change strategies included in them, such as education, give regular feedback, and some goal setting as well. And so what we thought was, all right, this is actually quite challenging. How can we do this? And we thought technology can help, because it's good for the patient, because it can enable some self-management strategies and behavior change, but it's also good for the clinician because they are often time poor, and technology can possibly help to deliver a high quality care. The key features that we tried to incorporate was to make sure that the technology would be accessible, would be reliable, user-friendly. It would give them some benefit, physically, mentally, as well as motivating, and it would be fun. It would have some stimulating effect that is challenging but still achievable. And we have looked into multiple technologies and actually tried out a few different technologies, but we've resorted in a tablet computer for our bigger clinical trial, which is currently running. So we have developed this program that has multiple components in it. So this is how it looks. It's called Standing Tall. And it's meant to be very convenient. It's got a few props in there, so it just has a tablet as well as an exercise mat, a foam, a step box. And the convenient side of it is that people can choose the duration and the time of day that they want to do their exercise, and it's accessible anywhere at any time. It's individual because it's tailored to their personal physical abilities. And it also adds some variety by unlocking different exercises. And it has a progression built into there so that it stays individually tailored for the person for a duration of 2 years. So that's the period that we're testing it. Hopefully it goes longer, but that's the only one that I can make statements on. It also adds some motivating aspects by the ability to track progress, and it gives them some health education as well. And we made sure it was user-friendly by actually designing it with our older participants as well. It has demonstration videos and diagrams and animations just to make it more easy to follow. And then in addition, we also have an activity planner so that they can schedule their exercises with reminders and goal setting for people who wish to use it. Not everyone likes to use goals. This is just an example of the flow. So every exercise program that a person gets has static balance exercises, some box exercises, as well as the mat exercises. And at the end of every exercise, they are asked how easy it was for them. And that is how we manage to tailor it continuously. We are running a clinical trial in 500 people, and we're actually recruiting our last participants this week, I hope. So 500 people, half of them are intervention, half of them are control. And we follow them up for 2 years, and our primary outcome measure is 1 year falls. And I can't really give any effectiveness information yet, but what I can say is we had a look at our first 100 intervention participants to see their level of adherence during the first 6 months. And here we can see that the adherence is actually really, really high compared to other programs that are available. So with a 74% adherence to the recommended dose. And this is another way to look at it, where we can see that the green bars are probably at a level that it will give them some benefit and hopefully also reduce their risk of falling if they do this for 2 years. So the large majority of our people are adherers with 90 minutes of exercise per week on average, which is really high. And overall, when we ask our participants whether they enjoy the program, we can see that their level of enjoyment is quite high, that they also see themselves using the program for 2 hours a week for a longer period of time. We have a user-friendliness of good to very good for 97%, and an overall rating which is also good to very good for the same amount of people. And overall, the feedback that we get from people from their interviews is that they really enjoy using it, and that it improves their confidence levels, and it makes them do exercise that they otherwise wouldn't do. So those are kind of often the things that we hear from our older participants. Just to wrap up, fear of falling. It can be a realistic appraisal of risk, but excessive fear can have adverse effects. Exercise interventions are likely to have a benefit to reduce fear of falling, but to achieve long-term effects, we just need to make sure that people are doing their exercises, and therefore adding behavioural change strategies will be crucial to have a lasting effect. Thank you very much.